Welcome,
Oh,
everyone. Coming to you from the back room at
Susan.
Tim J. Leary Studios. Welcome to the first Wednesday Art Talk. Stu is behind the camera. You probably won't see him. And I have Eli, come over here. I have a furry helper tonight. He will be helping us, I'm not sure, helping us enjoy our time. So I typically start with my libation, which I have sitting right here. This is not for you, Eli. So my favorite little flask, which I bought as a joke, actually. And just a little bit of scotch. So, cheers. So tonight, what I wanted to look at, what my first thought for tonight's talk was about Miro, Juan Miro, who I've always felt was my favorite artist. I like many artists, but I've always been drawn to his work, and I'm always curious about that for many reasons. But I first thought of him as an abstract expressionist until I learned a little bit more, and I come to find out that he's a surrealist. Well, that makes sense to me, that I would be interested in surrealism. But while I love Dali's work, I'm not as drawn to Dali as I am to Miro. There's something about the way Miro makes his forms and his images. So that's our topic tonight, is forms, making of forms in abstract art. So I want to see if I can make a couple of distinctions and maybe create some definitions about that sort of stuff. So we generally, or at least I have, put art into a couple of different categories. Much of it is realistic art. It's very popular. People love it. It's beautiful. I love it too. But when I sit down to do work, it isn't what comes out of my pencil or my paintbrush. And so, I saw an article today sent to me by T. Santora, thank you, T, that talked about how not only is the experience of the artist different with realistic depictions that as different from realistic depictions or abstract for the artist, but also for the viewer. When you stand in front of something that has a recognizable form, it's more immediate in a way. You're looking at the story, you're looking for details, you're wanting to find out what the story is. Now, the surrealists were also telling a story, but their story was an abstract, more of a spiritual or emotional story. When someone looks at abstract work, you have also a different kind of feeling about it. You should, at least I do, react to it in a more emotional level. You relate to what the colors are, what the shapes are, and how the colors and shapes go together. So here's some examples. I love me some books. So let me get this first one here, which is an earlier thing. This is the Sistine Chapel. And this is the Last Judgment. Michelangelo is depicting, even though it's a mythological story, if you will, he is depicting that story in a realistic way. The purpose of this kind of art, it's said, was to educate the followers who were illiterate, who didn't read, and so they would understand the stories actually through the emotions of the story. So that's one kind of storytelling. But here's another, a painting, a lovely painting that we had the distinct pleasure of seeing one time at the Rijksmuseum. And this is a Vermeer. This woman is pouring milk. His work is so exquisite because it looks as though the milk is actually moving, like you can imagine. You can almost hear it. But here, you're standing here, And the questions that come to my mind when I look at this have to do with who is she, what is she doing, what is her role, what is her social standing in this case, what's for dinner. So those are the things that, that come to mind with that. So, all right, history. But for me, even though this is now history, I've always talked about Kandinsky because I love Kandinsky, and if you've looked at my work in the past, you have seen that that some of it reflects his work. In 1911, Kandinsky wrote a book. He wrote many books, but this particular book is concerning the spiritual in art. And so that is something I want to read something. So what he's talking about in this is he sees, you know, here he is at the Bauhaus in 1911, and he sees that there's a spiritual dimension to making art. We've moved by then from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism. Cubism is coming along during this period of time. And so he's looking at these images as spiritual, which is a little different, I think, than the way Picasso created images and Cezanne. So I want to read two things here where he's talking about that. So this is Kandinsky writing. Using other means which are closer to purely pictorial, Cezanne, the seeker after new laws of form, sets himself a similar task. He knows how to create a living being out of a teacup, or rather how to recognize such a being with this cup. He can raise still life to a level where externally dead objects come internally alive. He treats these objects just as he does people, for he had the gift of seeing inner life everywhere. He expresses them in terms of color, thus creating an inner painterly note, and molds them in a form that can be raised to the level of abstract sounding, harmonious, often mathematical formulas. It is not a man, nor an apple, nor a tree that is represented. They are all used by Cezanne to create an object with an internal painterly quality, a picture. This is what Henri Matisse, one of the greatest of the modern French painters, also calls his work. He paints pictures, and in those pictures, he seeks to reproduce the divine. To achieve this, the only resources he uses are the object, a person or whatever it may be, which he uses as a point of departure, and those means that belong to painting and painting alone, color and form. So that's a mouthful. Let's take a look at Matisse here. This is an exhibit I did not see, Cezanne and Beyond. It's Cezanne compared to other artists of his time. So this is color and form. So is this a picture about bathers with a turtle, 1908? Or is he trying to relate something a little more inner? And I think that that's kind of the difference here. It's no accident that this is happening during the time, the development of psychoanalysis by Freud. So that's Cezanne. There's a couple others in here I wanted to flip to. This is a little earlier. This is a still life with oranges from, there must be a year, 1899. Really only a few years before that. So this is Cezanne. Let's go back to Kandinsky. So he now says, the other great Parisian, the Spaniard Pablo Picasso, never succumbs to this kind of beauty. Led on always by the need for self-expression, often driven wildly onward, Picasso throws himself from one external means to another. if a chasm lies between them, Picasso makes a wild leap, and there he is, standing on the other side, much to the horror of his incredibly numerous followers. They had just thought that they had caught up with him, and now they must begin the painful descent and start the climb all over again. In this way, arose the latest French movement, Cubism, which is discussed more fully in part 2. Picasso seeks to achieve the constructive element through numerical relations. There's a little more math again. In his latest works, 1911, he arrives at the destruction of the material object by a logical path, not by dissolving it, but by breaking it up into its individual parts and scattering these parts in a constructive fashion over the canvas. That sounds like Kandinsky's description of Cubism, so let me read it again. He arrives at the destruction of the material object by a logical path, not by dissolving it, but by breaking it up into its individual parts and scattering these parts in a constructive fashion over the canvas. Now where's my spot? Oh yes, in the process he seems, strangely enough, to wish to retain a semblance of the material object. Picasso is not frightened by any means, and if color distracts him from solving the problem of purely linear form, he throws it overboard and paints a picture in browns and whites. These problems also constitute his chief strength. Matisse, color; Picasso, form. Two great pointers toward one great goal. So, beautifully put, I think. So here you have, so it's color and form. These are two ways of thinking about it. So I have a couple of Picasso. So Picasso is with George Rock, creating Cubism at the time that Kandinsky was writing this book. So here are a couple of examples of Cubism. These may not be the best. So as Kandinsky is explaining, the color for Picasso got in the way. So he made it brown and black and white and made us think a little harder about what it is. So it seems to me that in the 20th century, this work maybe got, I don't know if this is fair, if it got more intellectual, but that is kind of how I experience this. I experience these things as, of course Picasso became famous for other stuff too. I experience these things as different ways of looking at art and of experiencing it. So as many of you know, I've studied art therapy, and so I'm right in there with the idea that creating art is a spiritual practice. And it's certainly used that way in some art therapeutic settings, either as therapeutic as it feels good to make art, or in a more psychoanalytical way, which is how I think Dali worked.